In the previous video, we had a deep dive into the concept of scope. In this video, let us learn about a very important construct, and that is hoisting. So what is hoisting? For this, we first need to understand how the code is executed in JavaScript. Now, JavaScript code execution happens in two phases. So the first is the creation phase, and the second one is the execution phase. In the creation phase, the JavaScript engine will go over your code, but it will not execute it. Instead, it will place variables and functions that it encounters while going from top to bottom in the memory. So this is the phase in which we only pass the code from top to bottom, but no code execution really happens in this phase. So here we parse the code from top to bottom. Now this storage of variables and functions in memory is what happens in creation phase, right? So we have this default behavior of moving all the declarations at the top of the scope before the actual code execution occurs. So the advantage of this is that no matter where our functions and variables get declared, so suppose this is our script file and our functions and variables are declared right here, they are always hoisted to the top of their scope regardless of whether their scope is global or local. This provides us with additional benefit that we can even invoke our functions right before their actual definitions, which we will see in just a minute. So suppose here we are having some code which involves some functions and variables. Now this code will get hoisted at the top of the scope. So you can say right here in the creation phase. So what happens in this case is, say if this is a function, you can invoke it right before its definition and even after its definition at this point, right? So you can call it at this point, or you can even call it at this point, because this code will get hoisted to the top of its scope. Next we have the execution phase, in which the actual code execution takes place. The interesting thing that happens in this phase is that the JavaScript engine is already aware of those variables and functions which it had earlier committed to memory, so we can directly execute them as and when required. In this phase, the actual code execution happens from top to bottom of the script. So let us understand the concept with the help of an example to make it crystal clear. So let us head over to Visual Studio Code, and right inside the index.html file, I will link the hoisting.js file. Now let us say here we have a variable trip count and set this to 5. So const trip count, and I'm setting this to a value of 5. Now right before defining a function, which is the make trips function that I will define in just a minute, let us invoke it first. So make trips. So first I'm invoking, right? Invoking before defining the function. Next let us add a function make trips, and inside here we will iterate trip count times and print some message to the console. So function make trips. So here let us add a for loop and print some message to the console. So here I can say for let I as 0, I less than trip count, I plus plus, and console.log template strings. So going on trip I plus 1, like this. So here you can see, instead of invoking this function right down below its definition, we are instead invoking it right before its definition right here. Now to see this in action, let us head over to the browser and give this a preview. And here in the console you can see the output going on trip 1, going on trip 2 till going on trip 5. And you can see the function did work even though we invoked it right before the actual function definition. Now the reason this code works is because of the concept of hoisting. So what happens here is that the function declaration that we have for make trips, which is this one, gets hoisted at the top in the creation phase. So in the creation phase, something like this happens. It goes at the top of the scope in which it is defined in. And in the execution phase, this invocation runs this function. But this happens only behind the scenes, right? Now right after the creation phase, the JavaScript engine remembers this function, and when we execute the make trips function, it always works irrespective of the fact that whether we place the invocation of this function before the function definition or right after it. So in essence, hoisting occurs during the creation phase of the execution context that moves the variables and function declarations to the top of our script file, and it is in the execution phase when the real execution actually takes place. Now, as a side note, the variables and function declarations are not physically moving to the top of the file, but instead what happens is the storage of variables and function declarations in memory in the creation phase. And once we have them registered in the memory, it is then we actually execute our code. So basically in the creation phase, we are storing our variables and function declarations in the memory, and once we have them registered in the memory, then in the execution phase, the actual code execution happens. Next, let us see hoisting for variables. Hoisting for variables. So let us say we have a variable user ID and let us define it using the var keyword. So var user ID and set this to the nerdy dev. And right before the variable definition, let us log the user ID to the console. So console.log user ID. Now do you expect this to work? Let us give this a preview in the browser to see what we get. And you can see that we are getting undefined being logged to the console. So what is the reason behind this output? So what happens here is that the user ID, the declaration part that we are having to the left of the equal sign, gets registered in the memory during the creation phase of the execution context, and it is implicitly assigned a value of undefined. So when the actual code execution happens, the code gets executed from top to bottom. It runs all the code starting from the top of the file. Then when JavaScript engine encounters this line, it logs the user ID value that was registered in the creation phase, which was undefined as I just mentioned, which is then later reassigned to the nerdy dev after this log. And hence the output undefined for this log. So we first get undefined and later we reassign the value to the nerdy dev. So this is hoisting in case of variables that we define using the var keyword. Now as a side note, only the variable declaration gets registered in the memory. So for this variable, what happened was variable user ID was set to undefined in the memory in the creation phase. Then when the actual execution happened, we encountered this statement. Since we had a value of undefined for user ID, so we logged it right here first in the execution phase, and then once this line was done, we set the user ID to the nerdy dev, right? So only the variable declaration gets registered in the memory and not the complete definition that we are doing here before the JavaScript engine moves to the execution phase. Now before wrapping up with this video, let us do a simple exercise. If instead of declaring a function using function declaration way that we had been doing till now, let us use the function expression way of creating the function. So what will be the output for this code? Let us say we have a function, say hello, that I am defining using the function expression way. And here we say console.log hello everyone, and let us invoke it right here like this. So what do you expect to get as the output for this snippet? So pause the video right now, apply the concept that we covered, comment down your answer down below with the reasoning, and then click play. So let us discuss this now. So for the code snippet, the same thing happens that we discussed just a while back. First, the creation phase will come into picture in which the variable and function declarations are registered into the memory. So the declaration part of this say hello function, which is to the left of the equal sign, which is say hello, is done. So in the creation phase, what happens is that the say hello variable is set to undefined in the memory. Now comes the turn of the execution phase in which the code gets executed from top to bottom. Now on line 15, say hello is undefined, right? So you are applying the invocation parentheses on the undefined, and this should error out. Let us see the output. And you can see it says say hello is not a function. So here we are declaring the say hello using the var keyword, and it is the declaration part that I just mentioned a while back that gets registered into the memory. And then the code execution gets done. It first invokes the say hello function that we define using the function expression way. So it tries to apply the parenthesis on the undefined thing, right? And hence the error. So this was all I wanted to cover about hoisting in JavaScript. We will see more about hoisting in later videos. If you liked the video, do give it a thumbs up or comment down below if you have any query. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the very next one.